other questions for Dr. Mojola?
About your interdisciplinary approach, how did you know when like an outside topic came up, how did you know that that was important enough to follow through on, and then how did you know, as you said, you need to know enough about the subject to be able to communicate about it with other people who are actually in that field? How did you know when you knew enough for that? How did you learn enough about things that you didn't think were pertaining to your research question before you started?
Yeah. Well, at the time, when I was interviewing, I have to admit, when people kept bringing up lake pollution, in my mind, I was thinking, this is not important. But it's a good icebreaker because everybody's talking about it. So I sort of set it aside and followed, like, you know, so when I interview, I start with what people are interested in first, you know, so that we develop a rapport and get comfortable. And then, as the interview progresses, I'll slowly, so I have my interview schedule, but once I'm familiar enough with it, then I just start slowly guiding the interview to sort of the questions or areas that I'm interested in, so that it's not such an abrupt transition. So they start with the lake, and then we move to livelihoods, you know, so how do people earn a living in this area other than fishing? And then from there we move to, you know, are there differences? You know, how do women earn a living? Is that different from men? And then we move to what are the challenges that women have, you know, and then what about relations? So there's some kind of logical pattern based on what people start with, talking about in interviews. And so in the course of the interview, I only know what I think is important. And so this is where the key informant interviews are helpful. So that I know, you know, these are the things that should, you know, important based on local experts. And then the interview, I have my own concerns in addition to the ones that the key informants raise. But then I just interview, and oftentimes it's when I start to see it repeated in multiple interviews that I start to realize that something is important. So the first interview I can, you know, that's just a side issue. The second time people mention it, I'm like, The third time people mention it, I'm like, okay, this is an issue I need to pursue. So then I start seeing if it's start asking it as a new question that comes up in every subsequent interview. And other questions where I feel like I know what people are going to say, so I've reached saturation, I ask just for confirmation, but I don't follow up so much because I'm like, I think I have a handle on that answer. But I usually wait to see it repeated in interviews as one way of knowing this is something I need to pursue. Yeah. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, and then the second part of my question was just how did you know how deeply you needed to like do your own research about, say, like fisheries? Like how did you know, was it when their answers started to make sense, or did you have to do a lot of outside research and talk to a lot of like experts, like who would have that ecological perspective? And then did you go back and do like more research about that specifically?
So the fishing piece came up during coding. So when I was reading through my transcripts afterwards, and I started seeing there are a lot of transcripts that mention, the lake, and there are a lot of transcripts that mention fishermen, and then other patterns in what people are saying about fishermen, other patterns in what people are saying about the lake. And then it was actually curiosity that made me think, let me look into the ecological literature. I mean, Lake Victoria is the largest freshwater lake in Africa, the second largest in the world. So it's a major sort of lake that people who, ecologists study. So I figured that there must be some literature about Lake Victoria that I can look up just to see. And so when I started looking first, okay, I don't understand, I need to look at some basic textbooks, to understand the language. But then I was like, oh my goodness, there's significant pollution in the lake. So then I started thinking, okay, I need to pursue this a bit further. So that happened like when I left the field. Okay. Yeah, I hadn't, it wasn't something I went to look for because I'm not an environmental sociologist. It was not at all what I planned. And a lot of that came afterwards. When I was figuring out like what is going to be in the book, what isn't going to be in the book, and so the fishing stuff was like, felt like an aside. This will be a side paper that won't be in the book, because what does the link have to do with why young women have high rates of HIV? And so it became this sort of detective, okay, there is pollution, does it have an effect on fish? So then I look in the fish literature, I'm like, yes, it does. And then, what effect is it having on the fish? The different kinds of fish in the lake, and then putting it together with the interview accounts of the fishermen and their migration patterns. And so that's how the story started coming together. Yeah, well after I left the field.
Other questions? Diana?
I'm always interested in hearing about how people think about the ethics of research. And I can imagine that given the kind of research that you do, there's several layers of this,
Yes.
right?
Yes.
Partly that has to do with simply the ethics of your relations with your informants, with the people, to sort of the bigger picture, why do this and how do I want this to have an impact and that sort of thing. I'm just wondering if you would have anything to say about any of these layers of ethical questions.
It's a really important question, also a difficult one. It was very hard to get my research approved because it's every kind of vulnerable population you can think of. HIV/AIDS, young people, some of them are orphans, international setting. So there were so many issues, and as it turned out, it was because I had anthropologist on the IRB who was able to argue this is really important research. So then there's a lot of back and forth to sort of figure out what is a good way to ensure that these young women's voices are heard, but at the same time that they're protected, because I think it is important that they're protected. I think that's critical. So I really believed. I think what helped me get through the back and forths with the IRB was I really appreciated what they were doing, and I was really glad that someone was asking me the hard questions, because I think someone has to. And I encountered, there were, a lot of orphans, a lot of girls with no parents, guardians, and so what I ended up doing was. It seems that the schools act in loco parentis, and so the permission letters for the school would sort of be sufficient for instead of asking individual parents. And I asked a lot of key informants in Kenya, what was the appropriate. So in addition to the IRB here, I also asked the locals. What should I be doing? What are the steps I should be taking? And that ended up being really helpful. I also went to all the district officials in every district. So I went to the district commissioner, the district education officer, the district health officer, in some cases also the district information officer, for all the places that I studied, to tell them about my research, to get their letters of permission. And then also just for them to be aware of what I was doing. And then in addition to the Ministry of Education as well. And that probably also helped with access. The fact that I had all these letters of permission, approval from all the officials. But they also gave really interesting perspectives on what was going on. So for example, with the teachers, I first found out that a lot of teachers were dying of HIV/AIDS from the district education officers, because they were concerned because the government had put a freeze on hiring new teachers, and so they found that a lot of schools were losing teachers and they weren't able to replace them. And so then you go to the schools and students are telling you about relationship with teachers, and then you come back from the field and you start putting pieces together. So and that was also challenging because, you know, I remember in one setting where the student had even told the principal, and the principal hadn't fired the teacher. And then you're sort of like, well, what do I do in this situation? So there were a lot of tricky situations like that where I wasn't entirely clear what I was supposed to do in that setting. But it's something I thought about a lot in the context of fieldwork. Yeah. Does that answer your question?
I guess yes, it does. But I'm also wondering if for you, the question of ethics also came into how you wrote the book and what you hope the book will do in the world.
Yeah.
You know.
Yeah. Well, I mean, one reason why it took me a while to write the book, to transform it from a dissertation into a book. And part of that was, you know, losing the dissertation committee baggage, all the things you add, you know, for your committee, figuring out what the real argument I was making was, because I think there's a lot of apologizing or covering oneself in a dissertation. I've read everything on this topic and everything, and I suggest this and I suggest that. So it took me a while to figure out what I was really arguing. But I also wanted to have a policy chapter. And it took me a while to figure out, so what do we do about it? And so I think for me that was the biggest sort of ethical challenge as far as writing the book was concerned, was I felt like describe the problem well, but so what? You know, so what? Especially when, you know, one is writing about a topic like HIV/AIDS, where, you know, people are dying. I wanted to have a policy chapter, and I didn't think that I wanted to wait until I had actually written a chapter before starting to talk about it. You know, I wanted to go back having something to say, as opposed to just, here's a good description of the problem of HIV/AIDS. But since the book was published, I guess I haven't done as much as I should. Going back to Kenya this December, and so I'll be giving a talk on the book. But in terms of actually giving policymakers, here are the things that you should do, is what I haven't done at this point. I've sent the book to the sort of big foundations who fund the programs for young women, HIV/AIDS. Now, how far that has gone, I don't know. So I sent it to the Population Council and so on. You know, all the people who I know send millions of dollars to programs. And also, I've sent my work to practitioners, people who work with orphans. But I think I could probably do more in terms of doing a sort of policy-friendly. I think it's even the people at USAID in Washington, D.C. have a copy of the book also sent. So I've done that. But I think more in terms of, you know, the one sheet, 5 bullet points kind of deal that the policymaker would really do. Yeah, I think my only excuse would be I just got tenure. So I'm just coming out of I don't have to be fully focused on keeping my job. I can now start thinking about, how do I make sure this is not just a book that gathers dust and actually is of use to people in the field? And so I'm hoping to do something in Nyanza province at some point. I've been talking about it on and off with folks in Kenya about having some kind of thing where I can talk about what I found. But that's what that's sort of what's been on my mind more recently is, okay, I've sent it to the people who send a lot of money on programs with young women, but how much effect that will have, I don't know. And I've sent it to a few practitioners. But now I need to see if I can actually talk to teachers.
Well, I
principles,
didn't ask
people
this
like that.
question to give you a guilt trip or anything.
But I think it's but for me, when I think about the ethics,
Yeah.
that's part of what comes up for me with the ethics is you know, is it conscionable to just write a book and assume without making at least some kind of effort to make sure that people who would most benefit from it actually know what I found. So
Well, I noticed recently that President Obama announced a new initiative to address girls and young women in sub-Saharan
Great.
Africa regarding HIV/AIDS
Oh,
transmission and
I
stuff.
should send
So
him
I
that
am
book.
wondering whether he read your book.
I
You
did.
know,
I did.
maybe it's already had an impact.
Maybe it's already had an impact, but
Yeah.
but I think it's something that sometimes within the framework of academia is not always supported.
Right.
So in fact, my I think it was earlier this year there was an article in the New York Times about young women and HIV/AIDS, and the editor of my book wrote me to ask could I write an op-ed, and I was thinking to respond, and I was thinking the Board of Regents are about to vote on my tenure case. I don't think I want to make national press right now, because there's sometimes a lot of pushback, when you're writing on issues around HIV/AIDS, especially if you're going against the grain or the convention. In this case, it was article on treatment as prevention. They found that a lot of programs had failed among young women in Africa, and I'm like, I think I can tell you why the programs have failed, but I'm like, I don't know if I want to at this point. So I think this was February or March. I think at that point my case was, and so I was thinking about, I don't want to get into trouble and sink my case. But after I told my editor, after I get tenure, then I can start thinking about writing op-eds. And so this is kind of the year where I'm trying to think about what comes next in my career and what kinds of freedoms I have now that I'm not worried about. Yes, getting tenure.
Oh, the realities of academic life. Other questions?